The night sky over Arbinda still writhed with thick columns of smoke. 1,000 insurgents wiped out in a single night, without warning, without mercy, without escape. The international media reeled. They called it the most precise ambush in Sahel's history. And in the capital Ouagadougou, for the first time, the people of Burkina Faso looked up, not in fear, but with pride. Yet while the nation basked in the glow of victory, a new plot had already been set in motion, more subtle, more dangerous, and deeply rooted in geopolitical ambition. As global headlines focused on the unfolding conflict in Gaza, with bombs dropping and sirens howling day and night, another war was quietly igniting on the African continent. Cloaked behind the banners of aid and peacekeeping, shadowy forces moved to reshape Burkina Faso. Their goals went far beyond minerals or territory. They sought control influence and to send a message. No small nation may rise without permission. But they made one miscalculation. Ibrahim Traoré was no pawn. He was the man who redrew the lines of sovereignty with blood, with drones, with the will of the people, and with a strategy so deliberate it made the enemy second-guess its own plans. This time he wasn't going to wait for the plot to be exposed. He was already prepared. This is no longer a tale of battle. It's the overture to a new confrontation where the world's eyes were fixed on Gaza, but the military footsteps had already begun shifting toward Africa. It began not with an explosion, but a handshake. A foreign diplomat arrived in Bobo Dioulasso under the guise of a humanitarian partnership. His suitcase wasn't filled with food or medicine. It held encrypted devices, satellite maps, and a list of local assets cultivated over the last 3 years. Just a few days after the victory at Arbinda, while Burkina Faso celebrated, the groundwork for an infiltration campaign was quietly falling into place. The plan was simple in outline, but devilishly complex in execution. Using the global distraction of the war in Gaza, a covert network of foreign contractors, mercenaries, and intelligence proxies would embed themselves in key regions of Burkina Faso. Officially, they were there to offer stabilization support. In reality, they were tasked with dismantling the very sovereignty Ibrahim Traoré had fought to reclaim. Their objective was clear: destabilize from within Sao distrust, and ultimately install a puppet regime friendly to international interests. The timing was strategic. Traoré's popularity was soaring, but his system was still young, untested in peacetime, and vulnerable to covert manipulation. The enemies of Burkina Faso weren't going to try another Arbinda. This time the dagger would come from behind, not the front. It started with whispers. Whispers in the market of Kaya. Whispers in the mosques of Djibo. People paid in crypto to spread doubts. Traoré works for the East now. He will bring war to our doorstep. The drones. They are foreign toys, controlled from abroad. The volunteers, just cannon fodder. Rumors grew like wildfire, and in the fog of disinformation operations began. NGOs with hidden antennas, aid trucks carrying surveillance gear, discreet military advisors landing at night on private strips. A small but strategic wave of cyber attacks on local communication networks timed precisely to coincide with misinformation spikes. But Traoré was not blind. His doctrine had always been built on one principle: never underestimate the power of the people. And in the cafes and rice fields in dusty village centers, his people were listening and reporting. The whisper war, as it had been dubbed after Arbinda, was not over. It had only evolved. In the town of Fata Ngourma, a farmer noticed a foreigner who returned every Wednesday to the same abandoned warehouse. In Kudugu, a mechanic was asked to fix a vehicle with unusual panels under the seats, later identified as signal boosters. In every corner of the nation, fragments of a larger puzzle began to surface. Within a week, Traoré convened a midnight council. No cameras, no generals, just trusted civilian coordinators and the core of the new National Strategic Cell, an integrated fusion of local intelligence, drone reconnaissance, and cyber defense units. Their conclusion was unanimous: Burkina Faso was under hybrid siege. But Traoré didn't panic. He adjusted. Instead of confronting the intruders head-on, he gave them space. Let them dig in. Let them believe their whispers were working. Then he began his counter-operation codenamed Mamba Silence. Mamba, the black mamba, was feared across the savannas, not for its bite, but for its speed and silence. Across the country, drones, once used for surveillance, were repurposed to shadow every suspected operative, not high above the clouds but low and fast, hugging tree lines and moving at night. Farmers, traders, even children were equipped with simple markers, reflective cloth strips, and coded lanterns that, when spotted from above, would trigger a silent alert. The foreign operatives never saw it coming. They believed they were operating in the blind spots of a broken state. What they didn't realize was that they had entered a hive networked alert and utterly hostile to betrayal. In a secret base near the Ghana border, one operative attempted to transmit a batch of field data to an offshore server. The moment the signal spiked, a swarm of microdrones descended not to attack, but to record. Moments later, every exit from that facility was silently sealed by local militia in civilian clothes. By morning, the base had vanished, replaced by a quiet field and an old shepherd sipping tea. This was no longer the Burkina Faso of 3 years ago. This was a nation that had rewritten warfare, not with tanks, but with time trust and terrifying coordination. And for the enemies cloaked in diplomacy and false goodwill, the message was becoming clear. They were not invading. They were being watched. The wind was dry over the plains of Kudugu, deceptively calm, hiding the storm that was gathering below. For weeks, the intruders had operated with growing confidence. They believed the early disruptions, interrupted signals, ghost surveillance were coincidental. They adjusted their routes, changed their codes, and activated deeper operatives. In their minds, this was a chessboard, and they had already captured the center. But they had forgotten one thing: in Traoré's game, the people were not pawns. They were queens, rooks, bishops, every piece capable of offense, of sacrifice, of watching. From his underground war room, hidden beneath a vocational school on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, Traoré reviewed the final intelligence maps. What had begun as fragments was now a complete web: nodes, movements, frequency patterns, drone feeds, all converging on one undeniable truth: a coordinated foreign strike was imminent. They were planning to paralyze the country in one sweeping night, black out communications, disable drone fleets, and storm strategic sites under the guise of internal mutiny. The operation was codenamed Nightfire. Traoré renamed it Night Funeral. He called upon the VDP shadows, an elite unseen layer within the volunteer defense forces, trained not in conventional warfare, but in counter-infiltration. Teachers, librarians, tailors by day at night, they operated encryption hubs, monitored cell frequencies, and flew miniature drones smaller than a clenched fist. The plan was surgical. First, they would let the invaders move, lure them toward Kudugu, where the supposed drone command center was based. It was in reality a decoy. The real center was elsewhere, buried beneath an orphanage in Banfora. Traoré wasn't just responding to a threat, he was orchestrating a performance. On the chosen night, the foreign unit struck. Disguised militia stormed the compound. Jammers activated. Power grids flickered. But something was wrong. There was no resistance, no soldiers, no drones, only silence. And then, the lights came on. Floodlights blinded the attackers. High-frequency pulses disabled their encrypted radios. From surrounding rooftops, snipers hidden for days under solar panels locked targets. A microdrone zipped past, dropping smoke that wasn't deadly, but biometric coding each intruder in a traceable marker. Then came the ground wave. From sewer grates and irrigation tunnels, the VDP shadows emerged, not in military uniforms, but in masks bearing the Burkina Faso flag. They didn't speak. They didn't fire unless necessary. Their mission was precise: capture, extract, vanish. Within 30 minutes, the entire enemy strike force had been neutralized. Some were detained. Others, fearing betrayal from within, turned themselves in. A few ran only to be met by villagers in nearby fields, holding smartphones already streaming their escape routes to a command drone circling silently above. Traoré's counterstrike wasn't about spectacle. It was about message. Every operative was treated not as a trophy but as data. They were interrogated not with torture but with exposure. Their aliases, affiliations, funding trails were broadcast through Burkina's encrypted public infonet. Within days, names reached distant capitals. Diplomats fumbled for explanations. NGOs shuddered suddenly. Aid conferences went quiet. But the greatest shock wasn't external. It was internal. The people saw it all, unedited, unfiltered. They saw how close they had come to being turned against each other. They saw the face of manipulation. And they saw a leadership that had trusted them not just to resist, but to outsmart. Traoré appeared on national broadcast 3 days later. He stood not before a flag, but beneath a tree in his grandfather's village. "There are wars fought with bullets," he said, "and there are wars fought with lies. We just won the second kind." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was electric. Burkina Faso had defended itself not with firepower alone, but with a strategy born of its soil, its people, and its refusal to kneel. To the world it was just another patch of savanna, dry, unremarkable, forgotten. But on the night of the operation, Kudugu became something else entirely, a crucible, a trap and a turning point in a war most nations didn't even know had begun. In the hours following the failed assault on the decoy drone facility, something unusual occurred. International news outlets, normally silent on West African affairs, suddenly began reporting unverified chaos in Burkina Faso. Social media posts emerged of rebels in Burkina military fatigues, sightings of Russian-speaking operatives, and claims of a government blackout. It was no accident. The same coalition that had funded the infiltration operation activated its second front, the narrative war. They couldn't win on the ground, so they tried to take the skies of perception. Hashtags like Traoré coup and Burkina under siege began trending. But what they didn't anticipate was that Traoré had anticipated this too. Earlier that year, he had quietly invested in a civilian cyber resilience program, EcoShield, a network of digital volunteers trained not only to track disinformation, but to reverse engineer its origins and intentions. Within 6 hours of the propaganda wave, EcoShield had mapped its sources to a cluster of accounts located across Europe, North America, and surprisingly even within 2 major Pan-African NGOs. But while the digital battle raged online, something far more visceral was happening offline in the real Kudugu. Traoré had anticipated the possibility of a second wave, a more desperate, more violent push to take the town by brute force. His advisors feared escalation. He did not. "Let them come," he had said. "Let the world see what happens when you try to colonize shadows." The second wave arrived at dawn. Disguised as peacekeeping forces, their convoy was made up of advanced technical trucks, jamming vehicles and armored troop carriers, all bearing neutral humanitarian symbols. It was supposed to be clean, quick, and non-attributable. They were met by silence. Not a single VDP fighter lined the streets. Not one drone hovered visibly above. As they rolled deeper into the town, the invaders began to wonder, was Kudugu already taken? Then the first explosion. Not a bomb, but a sonic burst. A custom-built sound weapon developed by Burkina engineers disoriented the convoy's front vehicles by triggering their internal alarms and communications to overload. The soldiers dismounted, confused, blinded by flash pulses coming from storefronts. Then came the countermeasures. From hidden tunnels beneath the town square, the Kudugu grid activated. Conceived months earlier as part of Traoré's vision for decentralized warfare, it was a system of buried command modules, weapon caches, and communication relays manned by rotating civilian military teams. They weren't regular troops. They were pharmacists, postal workers, teachers, and they had waited for this day. They didn't fight with fury. They fought with coordination. Bursts of resistance emerged from seemingly random rooftops, but every shot, every movement was choreographed. Drones painted targets sent real-time feedback to decentralized units and scrambled enemy air support by mimicking radio signals. At one point, the foreign convoy tried to flee northward, only to find the road blocked not by troops, but by a herd of cattle, each fitted with infrared reflective collars. Drones, confused by heat signatures, held their fire. It bought Traoré's forces 5 critical minutes in a digital war that was an eternity. And then came the turning point. A group of invaders attempted to regroup at what they thought was a safe house, a compound previously rented under diplomatic pretense. But it had been flipped. Traoré's shadows had taken it over weeks ago and quietly turned it into a capture point. As the foreign soldiers entered, the gates closed behind them, not with a clang, but with a hiss of electromagnetic locks. A voice crackled over their stolen radio frequency, "This isn't your land." It never was. By sunset, Kudugu was quiet again. The dead were minimal. The captured were many. The message was undeniable. That night, Traoré walked the streets of Kudugu, not as a hero, but as a listener. He spoke not to cameras, but to elders, mothers, and boys who had helped guide drone scouts through fields. "You defended your home," he told them, "not because I ordered you to, but because you knew no one else would," and they did. Across the Sahel, whispers turned to words. In Mali, students drew the Burkina flag next to diagrams of drones. In Chad, market vendors spoke of the man who made Africa invisible to the enemy. In Ghana and Togo, communities held forums not to discuss aid, but autonomy. For the coalition of foreign manipulators, Kudugu was not a failed mission. It was a humiliation. They had thrown the best they had, tactics honed in distant wars, and been undone, not by firepower, but by vision, and most painfully by faith. Burkina Faso had not just survived, it had led. Victory in Kudugu did not come with parades or fireworks. There were no medals awarded, no triumphant speeches in marble halls. Instead, the town returned to its rhythm, market stalls, reopened, children chased goats through dusty alleys, and prayers rose softly at dawn. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted, not just in Burkina Faso, but across the continent. Traoré knew that military victories could capture headlines, but only systems could sustain a nation. And so, as the international community scrambled to recalibrate its narratives, Burkina Faso moved in silence. Quiet meetings were held in rural communes. Local defense cells began integrating with agricultural co-ops and school councils. The lines between civilian and soldier blurred not into chaos, but into a new kind of civic unity. What had happened in Kudugu became a model not just for resisting foreign intrusion, but for building a post-colonial future. Across West Africa, youth movements cited it as proof that sovereignty was no longer a romantic ideal, but a strategic blueprint. Yet Traoré refused to bask in myth. "Victory is a weight," he said to his council weeks after the battle. "It demands discipline, it tempts ego. We will carry it, but we will not dance with it." His next moves were not grand offensives, but granular reforms. In Bobo Dioulasso, the National Drone Institute opened its first public engineering lab, inviting students from neighboring nations. In Wahiguya, former insurgents turned informants were enrolled in a new civic reintegration program, not for punishment but purpose. And in Ouagadougou itself, a digital public square was launched, allowing any citizen to track government decisions in real time, an initiative Traoré dubbed transparency as defense. But not all reactions were celebratory. Foreign think tanks warned of militarized populism. Some international donors suspended aid, claiming uncertainty in governance direction. A few media outlets resurrected old tropes, painting Traoré as a young strongman with dangerous ambitions. Yet the people knew what they had seen. They had watched as farmers, teachers, and mechanics defended their soil with precision and clarity. They had watched as invaders with global backing were outmaneuvered not by billion-dollar tech, but by homemade innovation and community trust. In the northern village of Titao, an elder put it simply, "He didn't just teach us to fight. He taught us that our silence was a weapon too." And the world listened, even if reluctantly. From the African Union to the streets of Kinshasa, conversations began to shift. Could sovereignty be crowdsourced? Could security emerge from within, not be imported? Could nations long dismissed as fragile, in fact, be? Ahead, for Traoré, these questions were not academic. They were survival. He knew the battle ahead would be slower, murkier, not fought with drones or traps, but with policies, with food systems, with education budgets. He called it the long defense, a war not against bullets, but dependency. In private, he remained humble. But he was not naive. He instructed his teams to assume every reform would be targeted. Every school could be infiltrated. Every innovation could be co-opted. Hope must have armor, he told them, and memory must be sharp. One night, as he stood on the rooftop of the presidential lodge, looking out at a city that had once trembled under curfews, he whispered to an aide, "They will come again. Different faces, different tactics, but they will come." The aide asked what they would do then. Traoré didn't turn. "We'll be ready," he said, "because now, they're not just fighting me, they're fighting an idea." And that, more than any drone or ambush, was the true shift. Burkina Faso had become more than a country. It had become a demonstration of what self-determination looks like when woven through daily life, of what modern defense can become when rooted in ancestral wisdom and open-source tech, of what leadership means when power is not hoarded but distributed. And that idea, untouchable, untraceable, echoing across networks and borderlines, was the greatest threat to every empire built on silence. In marketplaces from Bamako to Nairobi, a new phrase emerged in quiet tones: "Don't whisper. Do what Traoré did." And in dusty classrooms, when teachers drew maps of Africa, little hands began marking not just capitals or rivers, but Kudugu with tiny red dots. Not because it was a battlefield, but because it was proof. Proof that even in the heart of adversity, a nation can teach the world how to fight, not just to survive, but to belong to itself. The story of Burkina Faso's resistance against covert foreign aggression is more than a tale of military cunning. It is a manifesto for modern sovereignty, a blueprint, authored not in Western boardrooms, but in dusty villages and underground command centers powered by ordinary people. In Kudugu, Burkina Faso did not just win a battle. It taught the world a new doctrine that the future of Africa will be determined not by imported models, but by localized resilience, ancestral knowledge, and civic solidarity. The first and most profound lesson is that sovereignty in the 21st century must be multidimensional. Traoré understood that control over borders and military hardware is no longer sufficient. Today, sovereignty extends into cyberspace, narrative space, and even the subconscious of a population. The attack against Burkina Faso was not launched with tanks, but with rumors, digital whispers, and false humanitarian flags. Traoré's response, precise, deliberate, and deeply embedded in the civic body, demonstrates that defending a nation requires not just soldiers, but storytellers, farmers, engineers, and mothers with phones. Second, this narrative shows that information is now a weapon and a shield. The use of digital volunteers through the Echo Shield program to trace misinformation campaigns is a revolutionary act. For decades, Africa has been portrayed through foreign lenses, manipulated through edited headlines and biased data. But in this story, Africa turned the lens around. Traoré didn't just defend his people physically, he armed them with clarity. Every intercepted rumor was met not with censorship, but with exposure. In doing so, Burkina Faso redefined propaganda not as something to be suppressed, but something to be dissected and publicly neutralized. Third, the story underscores the strategic value of civilian empowerment. The VDP shadows weren't elite military units trained abroad. They were teachers, tailors, students, people trained to think, coordinate, and trust. In many post-colonial states, the idea of civilian defense is often dismissed as primitive or chaotic. But Traoré proved the opposite. He showed that a decentralized defense network, when built on trust and local knowledge, can outperform centralized militaries that rely on foreign logistics and outdated doctrine. The fourth lesson is one of narrative control. After the failed infiltration, international media attempted to redirect the conversation with disinformation and manufactured hashtags. Yet this time, Africa did not wait for permission to speak. Traoré's decision to appear under a tree in his grandfather's village, rather than behind a podium, was not a symbol of humility, but of message discipline. He communicated that leadership is not defined by spectacle, but by proximity. That victory is not proven through medals, but through restored normalcy. And that in Africa, truth resonates most when spoken in familiar places, in familiar tones. There is also a deeper psychological shift revealed in the aftermath. The people of Burkina Faso, for perhaps the first time in decades, did not see themselves as victims or dependents. They saw themselves as guardians. This mental shift from receiver to resistor, from survivor to strategist, is the most important transformation any post-colonial state can undergo. Traoré didn't just repel enemies. He rewired the national identity. From a continental perspective, this story is a wake-up call to other African nations. For years, many have accepted the illusion that security must be outsourced, that development must be foreign-funded, and that resistance invites punishment. But Burkina Faso has flipped that script. The whispers that once divided nations are now forging new solidarity across the Sahel. In Mali, Chad, Ghana, even the Democratic Republic of Congo, young Africans are beginning to ask, if they could do it, why can't we? Furthermore, the Kudugu operation demonstrated the power of anticipation over reaction. Traoré was not caught off guard. He had predicted the infiltration, the narrative warfare, even the disguised convoys. His strategy was not to fight panic with panic, but to let the enemy fall into their own illusions. This reveals a critical insight. For African leaders, power does not lie in control alone, but in preparation, in planning for betrayal, in investing in people, not just weapons. And yet this story also issues a caution: victory invites new threats. As Traoré himself noted, victory is a weight. What Burkina Faso has achieved is monumental, but it is also fragile. External actors will recalibrate. Covert funding will increase. Think tanks will try to delegitimize this model under the guise of academic analysis. Already, accusations of populism and militarism are surfacing. The world rarely tolerates African independence when it threatens global hierarchies. But herein lies another enduring lesson. Authentic transformation cannot be reversed by noise. What was built in Kudugu was not a political stunt, but a cultural shift. It cannot be unlearned. Once a people realize they are capable of defending their own soil, telling their own stories, and building their own systems, they do not forget. They become watchful. They become dangerous to any empire built on silence. As an African, this story feels less like a fairy tale and more like a long-awaited manifesto. It speaks not just to Burkina citizens, but to all who have grown up with the weight of colonial legacy and the burden of dependency. It challenges every youth, every village elder, every policymaker to rethink what nation-building truly means. Is it foreign loans and imported solutions? Or is it trust, coordination, and vision built from within? Burkina Faso did not wait for the answer. It became the answer. And so the greatest lesson may be this: the battle for Africa will not be won in headlines, summits, or ballot boxes alone. It will be won in the silence between attacks, in the way a people prepare, the way they trust, and the way they remember. Kudugu is no longer just a town. It is a symbol, a point on the map where shadows fell, and instead of darkness, a fire was lit, not to burn the enemy, but to illuminate the path forward. And for those who still underestimate Africa, the message is clear. You cannot infiltrate what is already awake. As an African, I have often watched my continent through the eyes of others, foreign reporters, foreign soldiers, foreign donors. But in the story of Kudugu, something changed. For the first time in a long while, I saw us raw, undiluted and sovereign. I saw Africa not as a playground of foreign influence, but as a battlefield of consciousness. And in that battlefield, Burkina Faso showed the world that African nations, when rooted in their people and their history, can do more than survive. We can lead. This was not just a military operation, it was a spiritual rebirth. And as someone who has grown up hearing that African security must be outsourced, that African governance must be advised from abroad, and that African resistance will always be crushed, what happened in Kudugu shattered those chains of thought. Let me begin with what struck me most: the central role of the people. Too often in African history, our leaders have built walls around themselves, while the masses are left in fear and confusion. But here the people were not just witnesses. They were warriors in silence. From the farmers who marked drone paths with cloth, to the elders who reported suspicious movements in their villages, to the children who became the eyes of surveillance. This was not a military operation imposed from above. It was a movement born from the soil. That changes everything. Because when the people become the defense, the nation becomes invincible. No foreign power can occupy what it cannot decode. No empire can dismantle a structure that hides in plain sight, in songs, in whispers, in grain storage huts that double as command posts. Burkina Faso has shown that the most powerful security system is not based on satellites or foreign training missions. It is based on trust, local knowledge, and the will to protect what is ours. Second, this was a story about African innovation, not just in technology, but in imagination. In a world that often looks down on us as backward, Burkina Faso built microdrones, noise weapons, and biometric smoke systems, using local engineers and limited resources. These were not imported systems. These were crafted by hands that know the land. And perhaps more impressively, the greatest innovation was not technological, it was strategic. While Western analysts speak in outdated Cold War language, Captain Ibrahim Traoré was playing an entirely new game, using time as a weapon, letting the enemy feel comfortable, then striking when they least expected. This is the kind of innovation we Africans must embrace. We don't need to imitate the West. We don't need to wait for external validation. We can invent our own strategies based on our realities. Strategies that are unpredictable, asymmetric, and deeply local. Another critical lesson is about narrative warfare. The enemy did not only bring weapons, they brought hashtags. They tried to defeat Burkina Faso, not just with boots on the ground, but with lies in the cloud. I've seen this before, coups disguised as humanitarian missions propaganda, wrapped in press releases. But this time, the African story was told by Africans. The disinformation campaigns failed, not because they were weak, but because the people were strong. Because they had already lived through lies and learned to listen with discernment. The lesson here is that the next African war will not be televised. It will be tweeted, posted, and whispered into the ears of our youth. We must prepare not only with weapons, but with critical thinking, digital awareness, and local truth networks. EcoShield, the cyber resilience program created by Traoré, is exactly what every African nation needs: our own digital immune systems built, not for surveillance of the people, but for protection of their minds. But perhaps the most emotional part for me as an African was the quiet dignity of the aftermath. There were no parades, no self-congratulatory speeches. The town returned to normal, as if to say, we did what needed to be done. This humility is rare in our world today. It speaks to a deeper kind of power, the power that does not seek cameras, but results. In that silence, I felt a deep pride. A pride not built on violence, but on discipline, vision, and restraint. It also reminded me that true African leadership is not about charisma, it is about clarity. Traoré didn't rule with slogans. He didn't brand himself as a messiah. He listened. He delegated. He trained civilians instead of creating elite paramilitary cults. In a continent too often plagued by personalist regimes, he gave power back to the people not with promises but with tools. Yet this story also leaves me with a warning, because if we succeed in reclaiming our sovereignty, we will be punished for it. Western think tanks are already calling this militarized nationalism. Aid is being withdrawn. Media attacks are intensifying. But this is the price of dignity. For too long, Africa has been rewarded for submission and punished for self-respect. If we want to stand on our own, we must be ready for loneliness, sabotage, and smear campaigns. But we are no longer alone. In Mali, Chad, Guinea, Niger, Congo, we are watching, learning, connecting. The idea that began in Burkina Faso is moving across the map. Not as an army, but as a philosophy. A philosophy that says, we will no longer beg for security. We will no longer trade our children's future for foreign contracts. We will no longer pretend that dependency is development. To every African youth reading this, I say, Kudugu is not just a place, it is a warning and a spark. Do not wait for your leaders to be perfect. Do not wait for the next election. Organize, educate, decentralize. Become the censor, become the firewall. Become the shadow that protects your community, not with violence, but with awareness, with love, with strategy.